Welcome back to the Caregiver Minute, where every weekday family and professional caregivers gather to refine their skills, gain inspiration, and prepare to serve. I think we've all experienced a moment where anxiety was triggered, and sometimes we don't even know why it's triggered in the moment. This can happen to ourselves, or it can happen to people that we're serving. Sometimes we'll be interacting with a person and we'll notice that they're having a real stress response. It's like fight or flight has kicked in, and we're just trying to figure out what on earth is going on and what triggered that. They may not even know. In a 1998 book titled Mapping the Mind, author Rita Carter talks about our stress response and our fear response, what it is that kicks fight or flight into gear. And she shared an interesting experiment that a doctor did with one of his patients, an elderly woman who had so much damage to the hippocampus, basically the memory control tower of her brain, that she didn't remember meeting him at all. Every time she would come to an office appointment, he would have to reintroduce himself. Now, that's a very common situation for people with advanced Alzheimer's disease and other dementing illnesses that rob them of hippocampal function. But this doctor did an experiment one day, and he held a pin in his hand. And when the woman came and he introduced himself to this patient, he pricked her finger, and she recoiled in pain, but a few moments later, she didn't even remember what happened. Interestingly, the next time she came to the office, when he extended his hand to shake hers, she pulled back in fear, and she didn't even know why. There was a part of her brain that did remember that there was a reason to be afraid in that moment. So what happened? Why did she have that response, even though she had so much damage to her hippocampus that she couldn't even remember meeting the doctor? Understanding this actually teaches us something about what triggers fight or flight in all of us. The part of her brain that was involved in remembering in that case was the amygdala. You see, most of the time when we experience something visually and auditorily and with other senses, it gets routed through the thalamus, which is kind of a switching station. And then the thalamus puts that information out to other parts of the brain for processing so we can decide how to respond to it. But when it comes to our threat detection system, when we experience something that's dangerous, it gets encoded a little bit differently. The amygdala gets involved. And so when the information comes back in a similar situation in the future, instead of having to go to the thalamus and then getting sent out to other parts of the brain, it goes straight to the amygdala, which then goes right to the hypothalamus that controls our fight or flight system. And before we've even had time to think about it, we act. So for example, suppose you learn through hard experience that snakes are dangerous. In the future, if you're walking down a mountain trail and you see a coil of rope, before your brain even gets time to process and think about, oh, that's not a snake, that's a pile of coiled rope, your amygdala might already kick in and have you jumping back. And then when the rest of your brain catches up, you'll realize that that visual information was saying, it looks kind of like a snake, but it's not actually a snake. Well, the same is true in a lot of our interactions. If we've learned that some situation with other human beings is dangerous and threatening, and it might even be an experience that happened when we were less than 7 years old, and it triggered such a threat response that it carved a pathway in our brain that we're not even conscious of. But if those kinds of things happened, then later on we might find ourselves in an interaction and something triggers that response. That's the kind of thing that sets us up for having limiting beliefs. In other words, certain ideas that keep us from accomplishing as much as we could or even want to because our threat detection system turns on and we have a massive anxiety response. Part of what allows us to overcome that threat detection system turning on is to not trigger it in the first place. If we can understand what those triggers are, then we can do a little bit better. But that's often not possible. If we can learn to sit with anxiety and face it, then it's possible to rewire that circuitry, so to speak. It's possible to get more comfortable being uncomfortable and help the brain learn over time, this thing isn't such a threat. I've shared before on the Caregiver Minute that anxiety is a lot like a kite, and it only stays aloft when there's tension on the string. And if we sit in the gray area, if our brain is screaming at us saying, "This is dangerous," and our response consciously is, "Maybe, it's possible," then we learn over time that maybe we don't need to turn on the threat detection system so loudly. When it comes to the people that we're serving, if we're aware that they might have some unconscious drives that trigger their threat detection system, things that are deeply embedded in how their brain functions and the pathways that information gets routed down, it's easier to be both empathetic and more observant so that we can be aware of things that might trigger that kind of response. One thing for sure, if we try to respond in a logical way when the threat detection system is turned on and people are in fight or flight, it doesn't work so well. I hope that understanding how these pathways get turned on in the first place helps you both appreciate how complex the system is and also helps you be observant for things that might be triggers that you could avoid in the future. Well, thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon for another episode of the Caregiver Minute.